Hello again. This is Brennan Breed, your guide to not all things, but just some things, Old Testament, for the next few weeks. I hope you've been enjoying the class so far. I hope that the resources I've been trying to put online have been helpful, but please feel free to comment and let me know what's working and what's not. So, there's some very interesting and probably challenging readings this week from the Michael Coogan book. And I just figured it would be helpful for me to present some of my own opinions and thoughts and understandings of some of this literature. The Coogan textbook, as you can see, is written by someone who, I think himself a Roman Catholic, he's a Christian, but he's writing from the perspective of someone who's been writing in the secular academy for quite some time. He's sensitive, I think, to issues of faith, but it might help to get a little bit of a perhaps more overtly theological discussion to some of this material. So hopefully that's what this can be. But we're talking about the creation stories in ancient Eastern myths, the relationship between biblical stories and ancient stories. And I find it helps to think about, as I talked about in the last video, questions about what these things are. What we're reading are ancient texts from ancient Israelites. They are not modern texts. They weren't written for us or to us necessarily. I mean, by God's grace, they can speak to us and for us and through us. But it's important to remember that they are, like everything that humans do and say, they are a product of human culture. And human culture is not universal. Human culture is specific to different times and places, different languages that shape the ways that we can speak and the kinds of thoughts we can have. And so I think it helps us to think about the world behind the text when we encounter the text and when we think about our own role in front of the text. So just to get us in that frame of mind, here's a quote from William Hallow, who's a really famous biblical scholar who deals with ancient Near Eastern comparisons. That is what's going on in that ancient world. And he talks about comparative research. He also calls it the contextual approach. Both of those kind of mean the same thing. That is, looking at the context, the cultural, historical context around biblical texts. That is, what do people talk and think and speak like? And can we read other ancient Eastern sources that will help us to clarify some of what was considered normal or abnormal in the biblical text, in the biblical world. So his quote, the goal of the contextual approach, that is by the scholar, is to silhouette the biblical text against its wider literary and cultural environment, and thus to arrive at a proper assessment of the extent to which the biblical evidence reflects that environment, or to the contrary, is distinctive and innovative over against it. In other words, the only way you can know what's interesting or important about a biblical text, what stands out as unique or different or shocking, at least in relation to its ancient context, is to know what else was normal, what was typical. If a story has a twist ending, we only recognize it as a twist ending because we know how stories in our culture typically end. For us to see what's surprising or shocking, we need to know what's typical. And what was typical of the ancient world when talking about creation were these mythological stories. So we have to approach biblical texts, at least I think we do, from the question of the standpoint of genre. A genre is a type of literature, a category of literature. It really doesn't have to be literature. It can be any cultural product. You can put these different cultural products into genres or types that they don't just help us by helping us organize or categorize things. They help us by setting our expectations when we encounter them. So if you go to see a horror movie, you know what to expect. It's going to be scary. And it may not be realistic, but the whole point is to try to get you to feel scared. If you don't realize that walking into a horror movie, you might have a bad time. Actually, you might have a bad time even if you do realize what a horror genre is. But like me, I don't really like them typically, but whatever. So, but if you see on this picture on the screen here, this is a picture of a young woman who is holding her hands out. There's a butterfly nearby. There seems to be some sort of golden ball falling from the sky. I'm not really sure what's going on in this particular story, but it starts, "Once upon a time," the cover of this book. Well, "once upon a time" is a stock phrase that helps us to recognize a particular genre. And of course, that genre is a fairy tale. So when I say once upon a time, I'm not just starting a fairy tale. I'm letting you know, as the listener or reader, I'm cluing you into the genre, and I'm getting you to assume a particular kind of readerly or listening position. That is, I'm asking you to participate in a certain kind of world. There are certain kinds of assumptions to this world. Typically, a fairy tale is going to revolve around fantastical stories. There's going to be some things that you won't see in your day-to-day life. There'll be talking animals, and there'll be some magic, perhaps. And we also know that in fairy tales there'll be an innocent, naive child usually, and then some bad character does something bad, and then there's usually some sort of happy resolution in the end. Oftentimes there's a moral as well. We expect to kind of learn something about how the world works or how we should work, etc., from these kinds of stories. And usually there's a setting in life that these stories are associated with. So genres have particular situations in which they are evoked. So, for example, a fairy tale evokes for us the situation of a parent talking to a child at bedtime, or perhaps a teacher talking to a classroom, perhaps a grandparent visiting with their children. These kinds of situations in life are evoked by this particular genre of fairy tale. But there are other genres we can imagine, like, say, for example, the lament psalm genre in the Bible. What is a lament psalm? Well, it's a psalm where you're lamenting, you're calling out, crying out, you're sad about something. That evokes for us the situation of someone who's shown up to temple or some sort of local sanctuary, and the person is distraught, aggrieved, the person is suffering, and they're crying out for either justice or for God's help, for salvation of some kind. That's the situation, the setting in life in which a lament psalm makes a lot of sense. In that same way, a fairy tale makes sense in a house, environment with a family, right? Or some sort of elderly person talking to a young person about how the world works. There's another genre that we might be familiar with, you and I. That's the genre of the form letter, Dear Sir or Madam. Now, this evokes a setting in life, that is, you're getting something in the mail that you don't care about, and the person sending it obviously doesn't know about you because they would know your name if they cared enough to know those things. So it's probably not important for you. And we even have certain gestures that we associate with some of these genres. This one is the gesture of me throwing something into the trash, usually. But these types of stock phrases and these types of genres, that is, types of literature, set certain expectations for us. And the same is true in the ancient world. One of the things that we think about often when we encounter the book of Genesis, that is, Christians in general, often have questions about history, historiography. We could say the same thing about science. These are often linked, right? Is Genesis 1 science, or is Genesis history? And I think it's important for us to ask questions about genre when we come to this, and to ask questions about that world behind the text. So, was there something like our modern academic discipline of history or historiography, that is, writing history? Did they have archives with resources that would provide someone the opportunity to write an objective history? Was that even a category of thought that they had in mind? They certainly didn't have tape recorders or video recorders. They didn't expect that any conversation that was had would be recorded word for word. We can see that there are certain types of ancient writing that seem to evoke the sense of history. That is, the writers are trying to record historical events as they happen for later use and recalling them in some sort of objective way. But those texts are in the genre in the ancient world of Kings' Chronicles. If you look at the book of Kings, you'll come across some texts like this where they'll tell you what year it is and who so-and-so was king, and they have this very formulaic and very dry, actually, approach to these kinds of texts. The book of Esther makes fun of these kinds of king's annals or chronicles, these very royal ways of keeping time and writing history. And in fact, the king, Ahasuerus, in the book of Esther, is trying to fall asleep, and he has insomnia, and so he gets one of his counselors to read him some of these royal annals. They're very dry, they're boring, and it's even a joke that they're boring. But the important thing for us, I think, in thinking about our task when we open up the book of Genesis is that the book of Genesis doesn't read like those ancient histories, that is, the history writing of the ancient world. What should we compare it to? Well, not ancient history and historiography. What we should probably compare it to are other creation stories from the ancient Near East. And in fact, when we start to compare them to other creation stories of the ancient Near East, that is Genesis really 1 through 11, all those stories of kind of the world before Abram and Sarah, All of those stories seem to share a lot in common with other ancient Near Eastern mythic literature. And that word scares some folks or makes some folks feel uncomfortable when we apply it to the Bible, myth. But a myth is a story about the gods and usually meant to explain something about how the world came to be. And it's important, I think, for us to recognize that these stories don't really intend to be scientific. And they don't really intend to be historical. Ancient people had a way of writing science, and this is not it. I think that ancient religious myth, we can see from the uses that it was put to, and we can see from even the style of writing itself, that what it's trying to do is express core beliefs about how the world works, about who humans are, about how the divine world works. It's a way to teach people, not the facts of history or about science, certainly. It's a way to teach people about who they are, who they really are, about telling someone the truth of the universe in a story. Science doesn't do this, really. Science takes questions about the truth of the universe or the meaning of the universe, and it just kind of says, it's not my job. There's a famous scientific debate about whether or not science is supposed to have a sense of purpose or meaning. There are some scientists who have said that science and religion are non-overlapping magisteria, that is, non-overlapping realms of knowledge. They don't really have much to say to each other. I think that's probably not true. They're minimally overlapping magisteria. That is, I think science has some stuff to say to religion, and religion has stuff to say to science. But clearly, ancient people had something that was a bit like science. They had astronomy, that is, they carefully watched how the universe worked. They didn't quite understand what those stars were they were looking at. They thought that they were gods giving them messages, but they were very careful to plot their movements in the sky. Ancient folks in Mesopotamia calculated the eclipses in that region of the world with incredible accuracy that went out a couple thousand years from the point at which they started to do those calculations. That is, we today could even use some of those Babylonian calculations and figure out where some of the eclipses in the world are happening. Amazing stuff. That's ancient science. Genesis is not. It doesn't read in it like those star charts or astronomical catalogs or the catalogs of things on Earth, the kind of naturalist catalogs in the ancient world, those big lists of things. And they don't look like the book of Genesis. None of the stories in it look like ancient mathematics, which did exist as a discipline, but it had a completely different genre. So there are stories that read a lot like Genesis from the ancient world. As I said, some of them are from ancient Babylon. This one, the Enuma Elish, you can see that title up there, Enuma Elish, which just means, it's a Babylonian phrase, which means when on high. It's the beginning of this book. What we know from some of the ancient archaeological work that has been done is that, and textual comparisons, is that this book, the Enuma Elish, was basically the Babylonian creation story that associated with the new year. And it narrates the rise in power of the particular god of Babylon, Marduk. He was the kind of chief god of Babylon, in the same way that Yahweh, the god that we refer to as the Lord, would have been understood as the chief god of Jerusalem and of Judah, if not Israel as a whole, would have been recognized as the chief god of Samaria as well. So some major cities had chief gods, or gods that were associated as their patron deity, and Marduk was the patron deity of Babylon. And the Enuma Elish is the story that would have been read once a year on the New Year's Day, the Akitu festival, that would have occurred every year. And it would have, so as the new year begins, there would have been a creation of the world account, right? So New Year, the new world. And it's amazing if you read this story, and you can just Google Enuma Elish and read it. There's plenty of translations online. There are so many overlaps with Genesis, but also areas where it's different. So like William Hallow said in the quote that I began this mini lecture with, that comparative analysis, the goal of this, when we compare these ancient stories, is both to silhouette the agreements and areas of disagreement between biblical texts and ancient Near Eastern texts. So in this image you can see here, this is, by the way, a cylinder seal. This is someone signing their name. Ancient folks would carry these little pieces of a rock that had carved onto it little pictures, symbols, and you'd roll them out on clay. So this is the rolled out signature of someone. Someone could see this and say, oh, I signed that document. Lots of people couldn't read, but they could see their own picture that was unique to them. And this is a picture that has a giant snake thing that goes along the image. You can see that. That's Tiamat. That is one of the monsters or chaos monsters that originated with the beginning of the world. This is part of the ancient Near Eastern mythology, not just in Babylon, but all over the ancient Near East. There was an idea that when the world was created, there was this kind of chaotic mass of water. And Tiamat is part of this kind of chaotic water mass. And it's a mother goddess who gives birth to the lower and lesser gods. And then on top of her is the kind of striding on top of her. This is kind of the battle pose that he's in. He's carrying his weapons. That's Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. Marduk fights Tiamat in the Enuma Elish. And that's how the world is created. Here's another image. This one's from Neo-Assyria. This is a wall relief. It's been drawn here so you can see it more clearly, but that's Marduk on the right, and that's Tiamat on the left. Now, why am I showing you this and telling you all this? Well, because here's some of the comparisons. This is amazing, right? Here's the beginning of the Enuma Elish. When on high, neither the heavens had been named, nor the earth below pronounced by name. There was primordial Apsu, their progenitor, and the creator Tiamat, who bore them all. Because their waters were intermingling, no pasture land was yet formed, no marshes yet found. When not one of the gods had yet appeared, no names yet received, no destinies decreed, the gods were created therein. You can see some similarities to the beginning of Genesis. When on high, neither of the heavens had been named. So this sounds a little bit like Genesis 1. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, and there was this kind of formless void. Right, there was kind of a lack of stuff, and there was this kind of watery mass. The primordial Apsu is what that's the fresh waters. Then Tiamat, the salt waters. These waters, the watery mass was around before there was anything else. Well, guess what? That's in Genesis 2. This kind of ancient Near Eastern belief that there was a watery mass before there was creation, because their waters were intermingling. There's just nothing there, right? And this is also before the gods had appeared. So all ancient Eastern folks, except for ancient Israel, and even them sometimes, are polytheists. So that is, they believe that the universe is populated by lots of different gods. They also believe lots of things about these gods, like the gods are limited in space and time and in their bodies, that they don't know everything, they're not omniscient, they're not omnipresent, they can't be everywhere at once, they have emotions that sometimes run amok and get out of control. Ancient Israel, they share some similarities there with these folk. Ancient Israel also believes that their God, has emotions. They believe that their God sometimes doesn't know things, sometimes changes the divine mind. So you can see this in, say, the Noah story. God changes God's mind in the Noah story. So in any event, you can see some similarities there, but there is a difference, and that is that the creation story in Genesis only has one God, and that's it. Whereas this, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, and all other creation stories in the ancient world that we have, start not with the creation of the cosmos, but with the creation of the gods, that is the theogony. So here at the very bottom of the last line of this clip that I'm showing you here, the gods were created there, and that's the beginning of this world. And the gods are all related as a family in the ancient world. Apsu and Tiamat, the watery chaos monster gods, have children, Lachmu and Lachamu. They have children, Anshar and Kishar. They have children, Anu and Antu, and those are the sky god and goddess. And then they have children. Nudimund El Ea really is the name that's typically said in the ancient world, and Damkina. Ea is the god of wisdom in the ancient world. And then they have a child, Marduk. Now this is a little bit like Greek mythology. Greeks are actually pretty similar to the ancient Eastern folks in their mythology. They believe that there was a kind of ancient gods beyond time like Kronos, and they have children like Zeus and Hermes, and so so there's kind of a second generation of gods that you hear all the stories about, but there's these kind of deep ancient gods beyond that. Well, that's it. That's how this is understood in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East as well, in ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia. And the ancient Israelites would have known this very well. They would have, all of their neighbors would have had this story where their local gods were the kind of birthed by these great ancient gods. So the story of the Enuma Elish narrates not just this kind of theogony, the creation of all the gods and the birthing of all the gods, that they're all related as one big family, but also that there's tension, like in any family. Perhaps yours has this as well. But there are some tensions in this divine family, and there are higher gods that don't want to do much of the work, and they order the lower gods to do their work for them. And some of the lower gods get really upset about this, so they start a rebellion. And guess who helps them with their rebellion? It's Tiamat, the mother goddess who represents the chaos waters, like the waters that kind of existed before time itself. Well, so a lot of the gods get really upset and angry about this rebellion, but also they're too worried to fight back. Well, Marduk finally ends up stepping up, and he was a minor god up to this point in the story. Then he says, "Well, fine, I'll take on Tiamat," and he goes and fights her, and he actually ends up destroying the chaos monster of the ocean. And after he destroys the chaos monster, it says, this comes from the Enuma Elish, tablet 5, lines 135 to 140. The Lord, that's what they call Marduk, like the king, their king god. Marduk rested and inspected her, that's Tiamat's, corpse. He divided the monstrous shape and created marvels. He sliced her in half like a fish for drying. It's kind of brutal here, but watch, this is important for the world. Half of her he put up to roof the sky. He drew a bolt across and made a guard hold it, like a door lock. Her waters he arranged that they could not escape. What is he doing? He's cutting the body of Tiamat in half and using half of it to create the sky and half of it to create the ground. And he's taking this chaotic waters of the world and creating a little bubble using Tiamat's body within which there can be air. This is how ancient Eastern folks understand the world and how we live, how we exist. That is, we live in an air bubble in a giant cosmic ocean. And it kind of makes sense. If you look up and see the sky, you might think those are waters above. And then if you dig down, you might find some well water underneath you. You might imagine that underneath us, deep underneath us, there's nothing but giant water mass. And then we're really floating on top of a giant water mass inside this kind of giant air bubble. That's how ancient Eastern people, including ancient Israelites, understood cosmology, that is how the world is put together. Now, an important part about the Enuma Elish is that the world is founded on conquest and on violence and on destruction. And the world, even when you take a few steps on the ground, you're walking on the dead body of a dead god, a rebellious god. The point being, don't rebel. Just follow the system. Now, the way I understand the Enuma Elish is that it's read aloud every New Year's Day. It's read aloud in the presence of the king for all the people to hear, even the people who were captured and exiled there, like the people of Judah for a time were in Babylon as exiles. They had to listen to this story, and they would have known it. And in this story, the world's order is reaffirmed. That is, the story continues, and here's, by the way, we've got this little this little additional bit. The order of the world includes humans. So after the world is created with Tiamat's body, Marduk's heart prompted him, according to the Enuma Elish, and he devised a cunning plan. He opened his mouth and spoke that which he had imagined in his heart. My blood I will take, and bone I will fashion. I will create humanity who shall inhabit the earth, that the service of the gods may be established, their shrines may be built. This is part of an ancient story. There's another part to this story, which I don't have a slide for, but just trust me, you can read it yourself, that what they end up doing is taking Kingu, one of the rebellious gods, and they cut him open, and they take his blood and mix it with dirt, with clay, and they turn it into human beings. The reason they do that is so that the lesser gods won't ever rebel again, because now they have slaves to work for them. So in the story of the ancient creation story of ancient Babylon, all of humanity is understood to be slaves of the gods to work for them so that the gods don't have to work themselves. Now, how do human beings work for gods? Well, they farm, and then they bring a lot of what they farm to the temples, which are the houses of the gods, where the gods are understood to dwell, and they bring their goods inside, and they give them to the priests, and the priests supposedly feed them to these deities, and the deities are happy and nice, and the world continues and is well ordered and well structured, and the rains will continue and things like that. So humans in this story are understood to be part divine, but they're also understood to be slaves of the gods so that the gods don't have to work. So there's a hierarchy to the universe. And then also, by extension, there are certain hierarchies within human culture that are replicated as well. So the kings don't have to work. Why? Because they're like the high gods on earth. And the high priests, they work a lot, of course. The kings work a lot, but the kings don't have to go out and work in the fields. The priests don't have to go out and work in the fields. They eat the food of the people who bring them. Why? Well, because they deserve it. Because they're the high humans, just like there are high gods, and then there are slave people, just like there are slave gods. Now, the people who worked in the farms, say in most of Mesopotamia, weren't necessarily slaves. There was slavery in the ancient world. But the majority of people were farmers who, they were not technically slaves, but they were bound to bring a large portion of their farm produce to the temple every year. And if they didn't, they could be understood to be rebels, like these rebel gods, and punished. So it's not quite slavery, but that's the model for humanity here. Perpetual servitude and within a hierarchical system. Now, there are some differences then between the Pneuma Elish and Genesis, and we'll just take Genesis 1 for now. Genesis 2 verse 4 begins another creation story, another creation account. You can obviously read more about that and hear more about that. I don't have time in this presentation to get too deep in the weeds there, but I'd say there's a difference in style. Pneuma Elish is an epic poem in which there is a lot of high stakes and drama and violence and a lot of characters that are vying with one another. And Genesis 1 doesn't read like that. It's not really a story. It sort of is a story, but the story is supposed to have conflict, and there really isn't any conflict in Genesis 1. Now, there is in Genesis 2 and 3, but let's just take Genesis 1 for now. It is a remarkably conflict-free creation account. Within the ancient world, this would have stood out as very unusual. The style also of Genesis 1 seems to be somewhat liturgical. It seems to repeat some phrases over and over again. Some people have suggested that this may have been Israelite priests trying to create a liturgy that would be their own New Year's liturgy, their own liturgy that pushes back against the liturgy of the Pneuma Elish that they would have had to been exposed to in Babylon. So anyway, some interesting possibilities of differences in style. There are some similarities in terms of the beginning of the phrase, right? So the Pneuma Elish and Genesis both begin with a statement of time. When on high nothing had been created yet, and so on. In the beginning, God began to create the heavens and the earth, and so on. We can say that there are some similarities, just like once upon a time is the way you start a fairy tale. In the beginning, or when something was being created, is the way you start an ancient Near Eastern creation story. Now check out Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, at least the second half of that verse, which is when I think that the second creation account begins, and you'll get a very similar beginning. There's some differences too. Every creation story is unique in that way, but they all start with an interesting phrase. We can say that there are divine characters in both stories, the similarity, but also there are some differences in these divine characters. In the Pneuma Elish, they are a family, they're related to one another by birth, but also there's conflict and chaos between the chaos monsters and some of the ordering gods and structuring gods of the universe, and there's a hierarchy that ends the story. This kind of divine characterization is quite different in Genesis. God doesn't create a hierarchy, God just creates. God gives humans dominion in some way, but it's all people. There's not high people and low people. All people are understood to be included in the creation account of God created man and woman, female and male, in the image of God, and we can say anyone else has been created. People who don't quite fit those categories. In ancient Israel, we would have called these people eunuchs. Any person is created in the image of God. So this kind of inclusivity of creation, but also that it's all people who have this kind of regal stature, would have been very unusual in the ancient Near Eastern society, and would have really pushed back against some of the core beliefs about presented in the Pneuma Elish. But also God, that God is alone, really, in Genesis 1. Not fully alone. God, there's a divine we, which people explain in different ways. Some of that is probably the kind of divine messengers, but also the angels. But also some of that probably is the world itself. God creates the world and gives it the capacity to continue creation. This seems to be quite different than the Pneuma Elish, in which you have to kind of keep coming back to the gods and giving them things to be able to make sure that the world produces more food. Well, in Genesis 1, it says that God made the world so that there was seeds of each kind, and then things would just propagate on their own. This is kind of an amazing statement, a naturalist statement, you might say, about how the world works. But it also imbues all of creation with the sense that it is a co-creator with God. And I think this is radically different than many other ancient Eastern understandings. Like I said before, conflict and chaos. But let's just think about that for a moment. There's not a terrible destruction that happens in Genesis 1. The world isn't founded on the dead body of a dead God that rebelled. The world was created, according to Genesis 1, with harmony and unity, and with a sense of even purpose that it's good, and that it's good for God. It would have seemed very unusual in comparison with tension-filled stories like the Enuma Elish, or other creation accounts like in Egypt, the Memphite theology, like from Memphis, the ancient city, the Memphite theology. You can Google that and read that as well. And these are all, that's the one where, there's plenty of other Egyptian stories where, Horus and Seth and Osiris, there's death and destruction and dismemberment and all of those stories as well. We might pause and say, why is it that ancient Israel has this account? We also might say that in comparing all of these ancient stories to ancient Israel's literature, we might say we've moved away from some questions about history and science, but I think we've also moved into some much more rich theological territory. That is, what it says about who God is and what the world is like and what humans' purpose is. The manner of creation, we can also say, is different, but there's some similarities and differences. But what strikes me as different about the manner of creation is that God speaks the world into being in Genesis 1. We can say in Genesis 2 and 3, God gets more involved in creation. God is more of a potter, grabbing clay and creating humans in Genesis 2. God plants the garden in Genesis 2. In Genesis 1, God is far off and far away, creating by speech and by word. You can say that there are these different portraits of God that we have in the Bible that sit next to each other, and there's some tension there, but also I think it's productive tension. That in Genesis 1, God is transcendent and creates by word. God is far away, but also probably hard to relate to. I mean, this is a God who can order the world and is powerful and so on. This might be a comforting word to someone who feels like they're powerless and maybe the world is spinning out of control. Genesis 2-3 has a very different message, that God is near. God is close to us, and it speaks in anthropomorphic terms. That is, God is like a human. And I think it's a fascinating thing to point out that both of these are together in Genesis, right next to each other. Whereas in the Enuma Elish, you get a sense that the gods really are just anthropomorphic. They're much more flat characters in that way. There's also a difference in the place and role of humanity in these two stories. And we've already mentioned the hierarchical difference and so on. That humans are slaves to the gods in the Enuma Elish, and they exist in a hierarchical structure in order to make sure that the gods don't fight with each other and that the world continues as it is. It's kind of a threatening way to continue your life, but it's also kind of, to me at least, seems like kind of a grim way to think about the world. But it's useful if what you want is to keep people in line and keep them working for you, by kind of ruling by fear, I guess. Genesis 1 gives us such a different view of the world and of humanity. The point of Genesis 1 seems to me to be speaking to a people who might feel devalued in their context and in their region of the world and in their own history. A lot of biblical scholars suggest that Genesis 1 might have been written in the exile, in Babylon, by people who were coming in contact with Babylonian theology. It might have been a counter-creation story. That is, the purpose of it is to tell people who are being told you're the slaves of the gods and know better, and don't get any thoughts in your head that you're any better than that. It might be another word, a different word, a counter word, that tries to preach to people to tell them you are worth something, that every human being on this planet is worth something, and that they are made in the image of God, and that all of us are in our own way royal, that all of us have been given the task of caring for the earth. That word dominion, ruling over it, can be used in really pretty terrible ways. But the idea is that if we're supposed to rule over it like God has ruled over the world, then we're supposed to take care of it and help it to be creative, help it to flourish. That's our job. Quite different view of the world and of humanity than in ancient Eastern creation stories that surround Israel. And lastly, rest. At the end of the Enuma Elish, the gods get to rest. At the end of Genesis, everything in creation is told to rest on the seventh day. And I think that's quite a different message. That everything in this world has a space made for it. If you look at Genesis 1, the way that things are ordered, the first 3 days are making spaces for things, space for light, space for the waters and the air, space on the land, and then the things are made to fill it. The light's made to fill the space for light above. The sea creatures and the birds made to populate the waters and the sky above, and the plants made to populate the earth, and then the animals, and finally the humans made to populate the earth as well. Everything has a space for it, but then also everything has time for rest. That is, the whole earth is given this ability to sit back and relax. That is not relax and, of course, worship God and be grateful, but that idea of rest, it's not just going to church, right? That everything is given a space to breathe and be what it is. This is a unique part of ancient Near Eastern creation stories. It's also one of the ways where we can point to how Israelite theology is tied up in the way it tells its creation story. Now, Genesis 2 and 3 don't have that same idea of rest. That may not have been written by the same folks. It may have had a different purpose. That is, there may be a liturgical purpose to Genesis 1. The priests may be behind this particular creation account. And Genesis 2 and 3 may have been written kind of more of an oral folk tale, more of a family-based story of creation in ancient Israel. These, by the way, aren't the only 2 creation stories in the Bible. There are many more. If you want to read Job chapter 38, that's a creation story. Psalm 104 is a creation story. There are others as well. Proverbs 8, starting with verse 22, is a creation story that talks about woman wisdom and how she helped in creation. Read some of those other ones if you want to see how those stories interact with some of these ancient Near Eastern conceptions of creation, but also how they stand apart from them. Here's just a little image so you can see how ancient Near Eastern people, including ancient Israel, thought the world was, how it was. What does the world actually look like? This is what they thought. It's a giant bubble. God lives kind of up. The gods, kind of have access to the world beyond this. But there's a firmament, which is rakia, the Hebrew word that means the bowl. It's an upside-down bowl that's been sunk into the water, creating an air bubble in which we live. And there's the mountains, which kind of hold up the bubble, and then there's this land of water beneath us. Now, this is not a scientific view of the world, right? They did observe things. They observed the movement of the heavens above, and they replicated that in their way of thinking about the earth. But if Genesis was trying to be science, it's not doing its job very well. It doesn't talk about quarks and neutrinos or the Big Bang. But then we might say, is that the genre of this literature? That is it trying to tell us scientifically how the world came to be? And if it was trying to tell us that, imagine what use would that have been to anyone until the 21st century, if it was talking about quarks and neutrinos. And then actually, if it was scientifically accurate, it probably would say things that we couldn't even understand even yet, because we're still learning new things about science every day and revising our own understandings. So a science textbook actually wouldn't be useful to really anybody in the history of the world, if that's what God tried to tell us about creation. Instead, we get a story that we can all relate to in some way, and a story that tries to tell us the deepest truths about who we are, who God is, who the world is, and what our job is here on earth. This is just a little quote from Augustine. I won't read all this here, but you can pause this video and read it. But basically, here's Augustine, an early Christian theologian who was very important and prominent and powerful, who is telling people here within the ancient Roman civilization in which he lived in late antiquity, and at the very end of Rome as an empire. He's telling us people in the day of ancient Rome knew that the Bible wasn't science. It was not even as good as the Roman science that they had, right? So the Romans knew better. So he says, usually a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, other elements. It's disgraceful and a dangerous thing for a non-Christian to hear a Christian presumably giving the meaning of Scripture talking nonsense on these topics. So take it from me. Augustine, a 4th century Christian, who I think every living Christian would probably say was orthodox, and a powerful theologian of every tradition that we currently have. It recognizes him as an important figure. And he's telling us, don't talk nonsense on these topics. So if we think in terms of myth, that sounds scary at first, or perhaps it sounds like I'm belittling the Bible. But in fact, that's ancient theology. That's how they spoke. That's the genre in which they wrote their theology, their statements about God and the world and ethics and so on. And that's how ancient Israel wrote its statements about God and the world too. So by thinking about genre as a category of literature, a category of cultural production, and by thinking about which genres we are coming in contact when we read biblical literature, I think it helps us, gives us better theological depth and clarity. So whenever you pick up a biblical text, think to yourself, what kind of literature am I reading? What kinds of expectations do I think that this has for me as a reader? What kinds of assumptions does it make about the world? What's the point of it? And lastly, what was the setting in life that this text was related to? And that might help you get a fuller sense of what it is you're reading and when and why. So when you read the Noah story, there are other ancient Near Eastern stories about floods, and they sound an awful lot like Genesis 6 through 9. But there are some big differences too, and the only way for you to get a grasp on what the differences and the similarities are is to read both of them, or to read someone who's read both of them. So we don't have time to go through that whole story, but if you have questions about it, I'm happy to field some. I hope this has been helpful and at least somewhat helpful for some of you. But again, please let me know if I can be of any better help. Thanks.